Tēnā tātou katoa, te lofa lava. Warm Pacific greetings, everyone. I'm Warren Elwin, Chief Executive of Work Counts, part of the WISE Group. Thank you so much for making time to be here with us for Work Counts' first research webinar for 2021, New Insights on IPS Employment Support in Aotearoa. I'd like to begin by opening our session with karakia. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa punamo te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou e te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa, hui e taiki e. Now, who is Work Counts, for those of you who are not familiar with us? Well, we help organisations develop and deliver evidence-based employment support. This includes for a range of mental health and employment support teams around the country. We really see Work Counts as helping to support a process of social change, to see employment support integrated with care and treatment for anyone who is in contact with mental health and addiction services, wherever they're being delivered. And so I am delighted to be chairing this webinar today, and even more delighted to welcome and thank our presenter, Moira Wilson. Moira is a senior analyst at Insights MSD, MSD's research and evaluation team. Moira's been leading a group of evaluators conducting evaluations of individual placement and support. I think at this stage I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge you, Moira, for the commitment and rigour you bring to these evaluations. I think that you're always value-led and data-driven, and in this particular research we're looking at today, Moira's team has examined the performance of existing IPS employment support programs operating across 5 district health boards. I certainly think that these evaluations are crucial milestones. They're important because they provide us, with further homegrown evidence so we can move ahead with scaling up access to employment support for people using mental health services. So with that, it is my pleasure again to welcome and hand over to you, Moira.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Warren, for that lovely welcome, and I hope everyone's safe and well wherever you are. So it's a real pleasure to present this research today. I'll just share my screen with you. The study has been published, and I've just provided a link to the published report on this first page. And one of the things we were just work out how to page down. We're really fortunate to have a multidisciplinary team working on the study. Fiona Cram from Katoa Limited, Cheryl Jury, who was then at Waitemata DHB, which is one of the sites of one of the trials that MSD has been involved in over the recent years, Jessica Kawa from University of Otago, Brian Koo from our group, who did all the hard mahi working with the data, and Helen Lockett from Work Counts, but also in her capacity as a leading researcher on IPS. And I want to give special thanks to our MSD Research Ethics panel and acknowledge their contribution to the work, and especially as well, thanks to Warren Elwin and Lisa Martin of WorkWise. We relied a lot on their advice on how IPS had been operating around the country and where it was operating at the time that we did our study, and also very grateful to Dean Hislop, Kesia and Amy from my team, and Keith McLeod, who were really helpful with aspects of peer review. So I need to start with a disclaimer, and this is a disclaimer about the data that we used. So we used the linked administrative data that sit in the Stats New Zealand integrated data infrastructure. This is quite a relatively new infrastructure that lets administrative data and increasingly household survey data that's been collected for people in Aotearoa New Zealand be linked for the purposes of research, and it's very carefully curated by stats, and there's a link in their disclaimer here if you're interested in more about the data. I guess one of the things to say is that there's not great awareness and visibility around what's being done with the data, and we're hoping that this study shows the value that being able to link across domains like mental health service usage and employment outcomes as recorded in other admin data can add to the knowledge base about programs and services. And there's a special disclaimer about the tax data that we use to understand people's earnings outcomes. So those data are supplied for statistical purposes, and when we talk about their limitations, we're talking about their limitations in the context of this research, not their limitations as with respect to IR's administration. And finally, the findings and our discussion and conclusions are those of the research team, not Stats NZ or MSD or any of the other agencies and individuals who are involved in the collaboration. So with that, I thought I'd just start with a couple of background slides about IPS. I know some of you will be very familiar with the program, but there may be some people here today who aren't who are wanting to learn about this program. So authors talk about IPS having a series of practices and principles and being an approach rather than a model, and the list of practices and principles sort of varies from 6 to 8, but so I'm providing this one, which has at the top of the list integration of mental health and employment services. So that's usually through co-location of the employment specialist and the clinical team working as one team delivering an IPS program and really integrating the employment with the mental health and addiction care and support that a person is receiving. The focus is on competitive employment. So that's employment in mainstream jobs that are available to anyone who's job seeking. Eligibility is based on client choice. So there's anyone who's interested in working is eligible, regardless of, for example, how the mental health clinician views their job readiness, whether they're still using substances or whether they've had a rich and interesting history with the legal system. If the person is interested in work, they are eligible for this program. Attention to client preferences. So it's very focused around what the person themselves is wanting to do and their skills and aspirations. Another thing that really sets it out from treatment as usual or the usual sort of vocational programs that traditionally have operated is that job search is rapid. So people are helped to look for jobs soon after entering, and that distinguishes this program from this approach from services where people need to be helped recover from their mental health condition or viewed as needing training before they can look for work. This is really a sort of a place and treat at the same time approach. Systematic job development. So that's about the employment specialist developing relationships with local employers and proactively seeking out the work opportunities for the person based on their job preferences and really making a set of relationships with local employers that mean that they can kind of carve out jobs for the people on their books. So they don't just respond to job vacancies that are advertised, they go out and create opportunities where they can. Individualized job support. So the employment support is with a high fidelity approach, time unlimited, and that's for both the employer and the employee. And the final one there, work incentives planning. So benefits counselling, including advice on how work will affect benefits, supports the person right through the transition from benefits to work and through any on and off benefit that might occur as people potentially try a number of jobs until they find one that is sustained. So the existing evidence base for IPS is very strong. So there's been a number of systematic reviews. The most recent one had 25 discrete studies of IPS for people with severe mental illness. And there's very good evidence from those studies now that IPS has greater effectiveness than locally available alternative approaches in helping adults with severe mental illness into work. And that's around both the probability of getting a job and a follow-up, also job tenure and earnings. So people find work faster, they stay in jobs longer, and they have greater income from work. The evidence base for non-vocational outcomes like quality of life is still developing, and in part that's because the studies haven't necessarily been powered sufficiently to identify the effects on these outcomes. So studies have really been focused on demonstrating the effectiveness in increasing employment, and you know, the most recent reviews have really sort of put out the call to researchers to strengthen the focus on non-vocational outcomes to help develop the evidence base. So I put a link at the bottom to one of the recent reviews by Frederick and Van der Wiel. Apologies for the pronunciation. And that one, you know, for quality of life, global functioning and mental health, the effects seem to favour IPS, but the confidence intervals include no effect. And so we really need more evidence there. Few studies have looked at the cost benefit of IPS, and it may be that it's no more cost effective than treatment as usual, but people are obviously able to realise their aspirations, and the quality of life findings from the available studies is very encouraging. So there's emerging evidence that IPS can be effective for groups other than those with severe mental illness, and there's a range of modified models that are being developed for other populations and other settings. And there's a reference there to one of the recent roundups of that evidence. So the aim of this study was really to sort of for our team, it was to find out what we could do with these linked administrative data for the purposes of evaluating the trials that we were engaged in, but also along the way to build the evidence base on the effectiveness of IPS where it's already been operating for many years now. So we looked at 5 case study DHBs with well-established IPS services, with the aim of building a descriptive picture of the rate of participation in IPS where it's available, the profile of participants. This is a very intensive program. Is it reaching the people you would hope it reaches in terms of their profile? The participants' employment outcomes, and we looked at how those compare with an international benchmark from one of the meta-analyses that's available. And we had a particular focus on equity of access and employment outcomes for Māori and Pacific peoples. What we do in the paper, and I'll just talk very briefly about this today, is we describe the development of IPS-aligned services over time and the current national reach. And we had a lot of help from Workwise in telling that story of how things had sort of emerged and fallen back with fluctuating funding in some cases in different areas. So I'll take you through those findings now. So in terms of the rate of participation, we looked at the 3 years to June 2018. We always need to leave there's always a bit of a lag because the income from employment data comes in quite late in some cases, particularly if we're interested in looking at self-employment income. So we looked at a period that's sort of some years in the past now, but still I think relevant. So the 5 DHBs that we were able to look at were Auckland, counties Manukau, Lakes, Taranaki, Waikato, and we counted the number of unique people we saw receiving IPS employment support in those DHBs, based on the number of people who had contact with the IPS employment service teams. And then we counted the number of unique people we could see having a face-to-face activity with a mental health or addiction service in the DHB over that same period, and calculated the proportion of all those people who seem to have had a touch of IPS. And so those overall program reach rates vary across the DHBs that we look at. They were highest in Taranaki and lowest in counties Manukau, and overall 4% of all the people who had a face-to-face activity over that 3-year window received IPS at least once in that window. We also looked, one of the things that we were aware of was that not all mental health and addiction teams in these DHBs have employment specialists attached to them. So we just looked, the second table just looks at those where we could see from a contract that there was a mental health, an employment specialist contracted to provide services in that mental health and addiction team. So again, we've got a lower count of the number of unique people who received IPS employment support and mental health or addiction services from a team with IPS. So here we're just counting the people who we see receiving IPS who were served by a team where we knew that IPS was available. And then in column B, we're counting all the people who received mental health and addiction services in a team where IPS was available, and this gives us a higher program reach. So it's telling us that within the teams where IPS is available, overall 10%, 1 in 10 people using services accessed IPS over the 3-year window. And again, there's some variation across the DHBs that we looked at. That rate's the lowest in Auckland, and again, highest in Taranaki. So looking at that rate, the 10% rate broken down by ethnic group and by DHB. So the green bar, sorry, the legend's a bit small. The green bar is Māori, the blue bar is Pacific, and the grey is all ethnic groups. And over at the right-hand side, you can see that overall, the proportion of mental health service users who in teams with IPS who are using IPS is very similar across those ethnic groups. There's a bit of variation across the DHBs, but there's no systematic under representation or over-representation across the DHBs. So we overall very similar rates of participation across the main ethnic groups. So the second thing that we wanted to do was look at the profile of participants. We sort of drew up that profile as at the time that we saw people having their first mental health and addiction service face-to-face activity in the 3-year window that we looked at, and that just put everyone on an even footing. And then we compared the people who received IPS and the people who did not receive IPS. And I've just highlighted there where the confidence intervals for these percentages are non-overlapping, and that's telling you that the differences are notable and not just a product of sample size or one of the things that we do see is that there's fewer women in a smaller proportion of the received IPS group are women compared to the no IPS group, and that's a significant difference. And the other thing that we see is that the IPS group have a smaller proportion in older age groups than the no IPS group. We see higher rates of receipt of benefit in the IPS group and more months on benefit in the last 2 years. So these proportions are as at the time that people had their first mental health and addiction service face-to-face activity that we could see. And when we looked at these proportions with benefit history, as at the date that they started the IPS, we could see that 71% of the IPS participants were receiving a main work and income benefit at the time that they started IPS. So that was usually job seeker HCD or supported living payment. And 82% at the date they started IPS were not in employment. People can join the program to find a job that's a better fit for their condition and their aspirations. So, but yeah, the vast majority were not in employment. So the other areas of difference were that those who received IPS were more likely to have a diagnosis recorded, and that gives us a little bit of caution, I guess, about the diagnosis data. There's something potentially systematic going on that means that we can't really use the diagnosis type information as we might like to compare across groups. It's possible that there's something about the IPS teams that diagnosis is being more consistently recorded by the teams delivering IPS than other teams. So just a word of caution, I guess, about the diagnosis information that we were able to access. The other thing down the bottom there to note is that the IPS, the people who received IPS were more likely to have spent a long period in the last 2 years receiving mental health and addiction services, and they were also more likely to have spent a month or more as an inpatient. So that's telling us something about the duration and severity of the conditions of the people coming into IPS. When we looked at those figures, those proportions across ethnic groups, so this is looking at the IPS participants by ethnic group, and again we're looking for non-overlapping confidence intervals and this time when we're looking at whether those confidence intervals are non-overlapping when we compare Māori or Pacific with non-Māori, non-Pacific. So both Māori and Pacific IPS users were less likely to be in the 55 plus age group. The next lines are quite interesting because they tell you that 30% of the people who identified as Pacific also identified as Māori, and 12% of the people who identified as Māori also identified as Pacific. Both Māori and Pacific were more likely than non-Māori, non-Pacific to be in receipt of benefit when we first saw them and having contact with mental health and addiction services in the 3-year window that we look at, and they have more time on benefit in their recent past. They're also more likely to have 0 time in employment as far as we can see from the Inland Revenue data in the last 2 years, and they're more likely to have had some contact with the corrections agency. They're more likely to have a diagnosis recorded. Māori with a diagnosis recorded are more likely to have a diagnosis of psychosis recorded, and that's consistent, I guess, with the data roundup that was done for He Ara Oranga. They are also more likely to have spent long periods receiving mental health and addiction services, and more likely to have at least a month of bed nights. So some really profound labour market challenges for Māori and Pacific, consistent with lots of other data that we see in the recent roundups of data that have been done, and some other challenges that are pointing to a higher risk of labour market discrimination for these groups as well. So I guess our take home from this was that overall IPS is serving people with high levels of labour market disadvantage as the program intends, and for Māori and Pacific, some of those barriers will be quite profound. So the third thing we wanted to do was look at employment outcomes, and the outcome measure that we chose was whether they had any employment within 12 months of starting IPS. So we started the clock when they had their first IPS face-to-face contact, and we looked at inland revenue data and asked, can we see them with at least a month in which they've got wages or salaries or some self-employment income over the 12 months from that date. What we found was that 50% of all the IPS participants in teams that using mental health services or addiction services in a team with an IPS specialist found work within 12 months. That compares really well with an international benchmark of 43% with an employment outcome. So, and the other thing to note about that 43% is that it's actually quite an ambitious target, because in many of the studies that were included in the review that provides the benchmark, the follow-up is longer than 12 months. I guess the other thing to note about the benchmark is that it's taken from a meta-analysis of routine programs rather than RCT. So we know from a lot of literature that outcomes from a program are often a bit reduced when you're operating in a routine setting and outside of a research setting like you are in an RCT. So this meta-analysis also had a look at what the rates are in the RCTs. I think it was around 50%. So what these DHBs have been achieving over this period is, close to RCT levels for employment outcomes and well above the benchmark for routine studies that are just operating under normal conditions. So we went through those subgroups that we'd had a look at in our profiling of participants to see what the employment outcome measure looked like for the different subgroups and how it compared with that benchmark. So the benchmarks shown by the vertical blue line there, and the confidence interval for the benchmark is the grey shaded area. And you can see that for a range of groups, including Māori, Pacific, Asian, Mila a bit lower, but in all cases, the confidence interval for our employment outcome for the people we saw participating in the Aotearoa setting were either at or above or within the confidence interval for this international benchmark. And that includes both for people who had correction sentences in the last 5 years and no correction sentences in the last 5 years. So it's really encouraging that this program is really achieving good outcomes comparable to an international benchmark for a real range of client groups. And we saw this right across people having different levels of exposure to inpatient bed nights over the last 2 years, and more of a gradient in terms of number of years and the months in the last 2 years that people had received mental health and addiction services. But again, those with the longest durations of engagement were still within the confidence interval for that benchmark. So the summary based on the 5 case study DHBs. Sorry, I'll just drag so I can read. In the specialist mental health teams where IPS services involving team assignment of an employment specialist were available, 1 in 10 mental health service users accessed IPS over the 3 years to June 2018. Participation rates for Māori and Pacific mental health and addiction service users were not consistently higher or lower than average across DHBs, and across the 5 DHBs as a whole were equivalent. Those who received IPS had high levels of labour market disadvantage and aspects of their background that would suggest risk of quite profound labour market discrimination, showing that IPS reached the people it was intended to support in those DHBs. Employment outcomes varied across ethnic groups in a manner that's consistent with differences in labour market discrimination and risk of disadvantages and discrimination risk, but in all cases were in line with or exceeded an ambitious international benchmark. So we also had a look at, current national reach. Sorry, I'm having trouble with your lovely faces. And the kind of punchline from that part of the study was that there's quite low and uneven access across the country. In 2019, only around 3.7 full-time equivalent IPS employment specialists were available per person of any age, per 10,000 people of all ages seen by DHB specialist teams nationally. And there were no ongoing services in close to half of DHBs. So at the moment, there's a couple of DHBs with funding on a trial basis to run IPS, but there's no guarantee of ongoing funding. And in many DHBs, there are no services. And in those DHBs that have programs, there's not always complete coverage of specialist teams, and there's not always sufficient coverage for the FTE relative to caseload ratio to be where it could possibly be. So this table is in the paper, and just at the right hand in column E, we're just looking down all the DHBs, and we're calculating how many full-time equivalent employment specialists there were in 2019 per 10,000 people seen in 2015-16 based on the Ministry of Health's official reporting. And you can see quite a lot of variation there, from 3.1 people per 10,000, 3.1 FTEs per 10,000 people seen in Northland, and quite low ratio in Waitemata. That's improved since through some expansion of that trial. And again, coverage much higher in some other areas here. Lakes and Taranaki and Capital Coast DHB had higher FTE per 10,000 person rates. So our conclusions were that, together with the strong international evidence base for effectiveness, the findings really lend support to efforts to expand access to IPS in Aotearoa New Zealand. They suggest IPS will form part of a useful strategy of early intervention to mitigate against inequitable outcomes for people through the disruptions to employment caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. As the service expands, attention to and research focused on ensuring cultural responsiveness and equality of access by gender will be beneficial. It's interesting that the participation rates for women were lower than those for men, and it may be that there's something about the service something about what it's not doing. We couldn't see any mention of, for example, accommodations for caring responsibilities in the program documentation or fidelity manual, and that might be an area to think about in our context. And research exploring Māori-led approaches to address economic and health inequities will also be really important as part of the work that takes this forward. There'll be a lot of services out there that are already sort of disposals of through grassroots initiatives, and being able to kind of think about how those marry up with an expansion of IPS potentially, or where those go, will be really useful. So the next steps for our study, what the next thing we will be working on is an impact study that tries to estimate the scale of the difference that IPS makes to employment and other outcomes in the trial areas that MSD is involved in. So there's a trial in the Canterbury area and one in Waitemata DHB, and that impact study was required as part of the evaluation of those trials. So we'll be starting to go through the ethics process for that study in the current year. And an important focus will be impacts on Māori. We're really hoping that the study will help build the international evidence on effectiveness in improving employment outcomes for Indigenous people, which is currently very limited. I should say there's another study that's underway at the moment as part of our work program that will be being released later this year, which is a Māori-centred study focused around the 2 trial sites that we've been working on, just to understand implementation insights and stakeholder perspectives for Māori at those 2 sites. So we're seeing that as a really useful part of the evidence building exercise. So our next steps will be planning for our impact study and getting that underway later in 2021. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Moira. That was just wonderful. You have such a great ability to translate and communicate complex data and analysis into a really digestible format. So thank you so much. So interesting. I'm going to hand back over to Warren for your observations.
Oh, look, thank you, everybody. That was great. I was particularly pleased in the study to see that services reached people that IPS employment support is designed for, namely folk who have high levels of labour market disadvantage, and good to see employment outcomes at or exceeding international benchmarks. More I've been struck by that this is pretty complex research, looking across so many programs, a couple of thousand people, and comparing all of that data with the IDI. And I really want to congratulate you and your team on this useful work. It really helps a good deal to inform the future. So, and thank you again for your presentation today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just want to let everyone know that Work Council will be running further research webinars. We hope this year, just picking up on some of the points already talked about, to include a focus on Te Ao Māori, IPS employment support, and also around addiction services as well. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for your attention, and I'll now close off with karakia. Ki runga, ki raro, ki roto, ki waho. Hai Māori, eh? Go well, everybody.